new platform for me because I've been to many sessions as a guest speaker or keynote speaker, but for the first time I'll be doing the moderation. And as Srikanth was talking to me, and he said that it's little difficult and different, but let's see how it goes. So the topic is advancement of open banking and the way it will climb to the next level of advancement, right? And when we talk about open banking, we in India especially, we talk about API banking, we talk about UPI, we talk about account aggregator model, right? But I have someone in this platform who is monitoring and overseeing this entire open banking from the global point of view, right? So let's welcome Srikanth Gopalakrishnan. He's heading the technology in Deutsche.
Thank you, Abhijit. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So without much ado, let me just get into the topic. But before that, I'll take 1 or 2 minutes here where I'll be focusing on a couple of use cases of open banking, right? For example, UPI, as I said. Then the account aggregator model. There is another model we talk about, the connected banking or embedded finance, where banks are externalizing their digital services into third-party ERPs so that their customer can have the similar kind of experience using that API platform, right, in those ERPs. So the first question, Srikanth, which we have, right, is that how open banking transforming the digital banking experience for the customers, right?
Absolutely, I'll take that. But before I do that, I mean, I know there was a picture put up of me which had my hair all being black. Banking didn't do this to me. It's just an older picture. So banking is moving very, very fast. So having said that, I think that's a question that I'll take up. I think open banking now, if you look at it, right, I mean, I don't know how many of you guys, I mean, probably all of you are aware of this whole PSD2 framework that has actually been initiated in the UK and EU. That's the Payment Services Directive, which was actually upgraded in 2018, that basically allows for a methodology by which actually payments can happen across different financial institutions. So I think where I want to go to is, Abhijit asked about the fact, is open banking just open API, right? Open API is just the technical framework, and even with the technical framework, there is a lot that needs to be done in the back end. Just to give you a little bit of a flavor of that, within the Deutsche Bank group, what we do is we've actually started working with all of our development teams in terms of saying, when you want to build a new application, a new system, first come up with what APIs are required and then do the entire architecture formulation based on how we actually want to deliver some of these capabilities. Because when you talk about APIs are consumed also within the bank's own internal systems, right? I mean, we're really talking about seamless integration across systems in terms of saying, I'll give you one example of this. I mean, if you really look at it, counterparty information, there are so many systems within the bank that uses counterparty information. Now, you need to be able to actually talk across systems. And so essentially what we are doing is we're building all of our applications with a fundamental knowledge of what, how the APIs need to be formulated. Then you go after all of your business processes, your technical architectures, so on and so forth. So apart from that, I think I will talk a little bit down the line in terms of what are the applications and the applicability for our customers and things like that. But I think it's really about understanding the framework, understanding how you need to build systems to cater to that framework, and also making sure that regulations and also data privacy and other things are considered as part of the API platform and framework we're talking about. So I hope I answered your question, yeah.
Absolutely, and it's really helpful. Srikanth, I have a follow-up question on this. When you talk about that API, then building the journeys, building the product, right? What will be the best approach? First, I'll identify my APIs, then I'll build the journey, or I'll create the journey, I'll create the wireframes and all, and then I'll look into my API discovery platform.
Like I mentioned, right? I mean, so there's one point in time when we're talking about technology formulation, we said first look at design. and then you actually look at architecture beyond that, right? The functional design is more important. I think when we're talking about APIs, we're really talking about saying, if you want to actually have open banking as the framework in which you operate, I think you need to figure out what are you going to expose from the application? What are you going to be consuming from the application? So I think an API-centric development approach was what I was talking about. But the fundamentals and the bottom line of it all is, where is this going to be used? You can't forget the business use of that particular application or API.
So, I mean, that's another thought of mine here. So when we talk about API banking, 2-3 years ago, API for us mostly mean few of the endpoint or URLs. But right now, if you see, we are productizing our APIs. So each and every API has a life cycle, it has a proper use case, it has a business cases, it has a deprecation mode also, right? So that's why this framework is very important. Now, going to the next question, Srikanth, account aggregator. In Europe, it's a buzzword for last couple of years.
Sure. So I will go into, where is this being applied, right? I mean, we can talk about APIs till the cows come home, but it has to be fundamentally useful from an end customer perspective. Account aggregation is a very important use case, right? I mean, there are so many tools available in the marketplace today that look at, you might have 5 different accounts, which may be personal banking accounts or payment accounts. You can have business accounts. You can basically have transaction and investment accounts. As an individual, as an end customer, I want to be able to see all of these in one single place. Okay, how is this possible? The possibility of this is actually made available to the customer through APIs, through essentially what banks are basically obligated to expose, right? So right now, legislation only talks about payment accounts being, having to need that API. But I think the use case for open banking is much larger than that. One application is account aggregation. Another example I'll give you, even within the bank, right? There are a lot of things that get simplified. I mean, if you're talking about applying for a loan, the entire validation of what needs to be done from a banking perspective requires you to be able to aggregate information on the individual or the corporate in order for you to be able to validate the credibility of that particular corporation or individual. All of this is possible instantaneously with real-time available data through open APIs. Okay. Third use case, I mean, the other important use case is, portfolio management services, right? There are so many different areas in which, people are looking at what your investment portfolio is, what is it that's actually leverageable from the marketplace, and to be able to bring all of these together consistently is only possible with open APIs. So there are, laundry list of cases that we can actually look at, but banks and fintechs and other institutions are starting to work together in order to be able to get us to that point. Huge benefits for the individuals. KYC processes, another example, right? I mean, account opening can be done instantaneously because open APIs have enabled the possibility of validating a customer in a KYC process. So all of this are examples of open banking that's available today.
This actually took me back to 2020 when that pandemic started, right? And one of the biggest challenge all the Indian banks were having that time is that how we'll open the account because there are no physical contact. People are not coming to branches, right? Then this open API started acting as a video KYC platform. Almost all the banks that time, Indian banks, they launched their own video KYC platform where open APIs, they fetch the data from the Aadhaar, right? They fetch the data from multiple government registries like 𝐶KYC and all. And then we did couple of authentication layer, a KYC layer in between our own ecosystem, right?
Absolutely.
These are the huge use cases.
Absolutely, absolutely. Makes complete sense, yeah.
And talking about ecosystem, probably my next question will be very common. And maybe everyone is having the same question here. That, see, when we talk about open banking, we talk about lots of ecosystem, open ecosystems, right? Fintechs, startups, all these names come up, right? So how do you see that, how the banking landscape in all the geography, right, that will transform or reshape after this kind of fintech alliances or fintech partnerships?
I think globally, if you look at it, I'll throw out a couple of numbers here, right? I mean, if you look at revenues from a banking standpoint, it roughly stands at about $3 trillion, okay? If you look at ROE on that $3 trillion, it's about 6 to 7% for traditional banks. Traditional banks have high capital investment that is required. They also basically have a highly regulated environment you have to operate in, okay? Take fintechs as an example, or startups basically playing in this particular space. Today, if you look at the numbers, they actually have revenues of about 2.5 trillion. And their ROE is roughly about 20%. Okay, so I think it's a coexistence scenario in terms of traditional banks, because if you look at it, one cannot live without the other, right? I mean, your fintechs basically need a base of banking that's available in the marketplace to feed off of. Okay, so it's a symbiotic relationship in a lot of ways, but it's also a huge enabler for traditional banks to be able to operate in this space. Extending on that, I mean, I'll talk about a Deutsche Bank perspective. We've basically launched what is called it's essentially a venture capitalist initiative, right? It's called CVC, it's called Corporate Venture Capital. And what we are doing is we are actually partnering with areas that we think we will get that enablement that I was talking about. We actually partner with fintechs that have that white space that we don't cover, that they cover. And we invest in some of those startups, and we also co-work with some of these startups in terms of building joint solutions. So to me, you know, or the entire environment of the ecosystem players that exist actually add value to what we offer, as opposed to essentially looking at them as competition. Another example of what we're doing, right? Internally also, we need to start thinking like startups. All banks essentially have to start thinking as startups. And in order to make that happen, we have something called a program that we launched called the Entrepreneur in Residence. So we actually bring people in-house, startups that we actually can bring in-house for a limited period of time to be able to co-work with them to come up with those joint offerings that can be offered to the marketplace. So those are the kind of initiatives there are. So for me, honestly, the ecosystem and the fintechs are basically partners in with traditional banks in making the marketplace more interesting, if you want to call it that. Yeah.
Exciting, and obviously within the perimeter of the regulatory aspect, right?
Within the parameters of regulation, obviously. I mean,
that's always
that's the number one thing that we all. That's why we bring them in-house, right? So there needs to be a two-way understanding of what the regulatory environment is. Because if you look at it, some of these fintech players are less regulated than traditional banks. So I think bringing them in actually gives them a flavor of what the regulations are, and for us to be able to essentially extend our services to them to be able to have a joint offering that we can take to market.
Great, great. So my next question, and again, I mean, before this moderation, I was going through a couple of common platforms, right, where open bankings are being discussed, and I found out that everyone is talking about the blockchain or decentralized financing and all, right? And maybe not today, these are the use cases for the large banks, right? For, I mean, in terms of open banking, but in future, maybe in next couple of years, this will be, right? So if you'd like to, you know, share your views on it.
Sure. I mean, I'll probably go a little broader on that one. Just to answer your specific question on distributed ledgers and blockchain as a technology, I don't know if you know already, but Deutsche Bank has applied with the German regulators in terms of you know, a request to actually deal with custodial services for digital assets.
That's the news for me.
So we have a request that is with the regulators right now for custodial services to be offered. I mean, we are looking at digital assets. We're really looking at you know, possibility of digital currencies being available. Governments are starting to propagate the concept of digital currencies. India also has that.
We already have.
And those are the kind of things that we are trying to leverage and to be able to offer as services, tokenized securities, tokenized currencies, and so on and so forth, I think is is going to be real. It's real in some cases. It's probably going to be real as we move along. And we will work closely with the regulators because these need to be very stringently regulated from that standpoint. And I think we're working with the regulators globally to make those things happen. Technology, of course, is much, much broader. And I think we are talking about how do we actually bring in aspects of machine learning, AI, and things like that. Probably I'll stick with the blockchain answer and then let you take off on that. Yeah.
So I mean, about that CBDC, right? That digital currency. I mean, almost all the Indian banks are there, right? And again, a use case here already in open banking, but that tokenization is a different. It has a different nuances here, right? For example, I was talking about the connected banking, where all of my SME customers, they can link their account, they can link their Axis Bank account in their own ERPs, and they can do the banking from there. So that is also another form of open banking, but definitely with some tokenized format. And again, decentralized financing, right? Now, about AI, I would like to hear you.
It's a buzzword, right? I mean, everybody's talking about it.
Everywhere.
To be honest with you, right? I mean, AI in some of its more traditional forms, machine learning and AI, has been around for a fair bit of time. I mean, it's been around for at least the last 5 to 6 years, where we've been leveraging some of those capabilities for a multitude of things. We have been actually using that for standard algorithms like random forest, regression algorithms. These have all been around for some time. And what we've actually been trying to use those for is some of those reconciliation processes that we have, data aggregation processes that we have. We've also been actually trying to use them for some of the optimization of portfolio management services. Okay, and one of the other use cases we've been looking at is to actually use it for fraud detection and pattern recognition and that kind of stuff. We have been using some of these. I think really if you look at it, the main keyword that I want to actually bring to the table here is when we use AI or machine learning, I need to have explainability. Okay, I can't deal with black box technology. So we've actually, as a bank, taken a call that we will not be looking at saying, I will pump some data in, it'll give me a result, and I will rely on it. That's not something we can deal with because it needs to be very clearly explainable. If it's not explainable, that technology is not relevant for banking. Because I think there was one of the earlier speakers that talked about the fact that you need to be very, very careful about what sort of biases that actually come in.
Yes.
What sort of erroneous data. Even if you say it's 80% accurate, it may not be sufficient. It may be sufficient if you have a human in the middle. Okay, which is what we've done with some of the technologies which are not 100% accurate, right? What we've actually said is there can be recommendations that come out of these engines, but there needs to be somebody who looks at these recommendations and possibly speeds up the process of customer service, okay, but not necessarily blindly follow it. But the concern that we should all be having is how many of us today can get from point A to point B without looking at Google Maps? We've forgotten directions, right? And this is the biggest thing that we all have to worry as human beings, even in corporations, right? We can't say we will use AI and machine learning and say, yeah, you know what, there will be somebody looking at it, but is that somebody conscious enough to primarily say that may not be 100% accurate, so I need to be putting my brains in to figure out the validity of those use cases. I think there is a very, very human angle to this that I think financial institutions and especially BFSI sector cannot ignore, and we need to be cognizant of that.
There are lots of ethical angles to it, right? There are lots of it because we are the custodians of people's hard-earned money, right? And so I was going through one of the case studies of AI in banking, right? And I found out that one of the banks, right? They have trained, or rather overtrained their bots. Now those bots started reacting on the questions on different products. So if people are asking about debit card, the answers are coming from the credit card angle, right? So it's a little tricky all the time, right? Now, just one word answer I want from you. Responsible AI or generative AI?
So we have been, to be honest with you, I will talk about generative AI, right?
Sure.
If you really look at generative AI and ChatGPT and everything, we have literally said we will have R&D teams look at this. Okay, we have a bunch of people that are actually doing research, experimenting with some of the generative AI capabilities, working with the OpenAI technology, probably some of the Google technology. There's a bunch of them available today, right? We've blocked it for any productive use. All the sorts of generative AI we're not using in any of our productive applications. There are multiple things we have to consider before we go that route. I think one, the research that we are actually doing should be able to come up with ways and means of explainability, which I said is the bottom line. The second part is we obviously will be looking to the regulators in terms of what sort of recommendations they have, what sort of regulations we need to comply with, and this could also be different geography by geography. So we are completely bound by what the regulators are actually allowing us to do and recommending that we do, right? And so fundamentally, with generative AI, the OpenAI technology that is there and so on and so forth, we're being very cautious. We're being very prudent in the way we're doing research on that particular area. And I think most banks are doing the same thing, right? We're not jumping and saying, this is the first industry that should apply. It's okay for somebody to ask a question saying, paint a monkey in the forest and something comes up, it's okay. But I can't do that for financial transactions. I can't do that for the banking world. I need to be very, very careful, and I think this is the fundamental on which we are operating at this point.
Great. And all the banks,
all the
trust
banks,
me,
yeah.
even in India.
We're very much in tune with the peer banks.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
See, we are talking about open banking, we talk about API, we talk about AI. So impromptu, we'll go to data, right? Data being the fuel, right? And if data is the fuel, then APIs are the pipeline through which data is getting transmitted, right, into the ecosystem. So how do you think, all this open banking framework we have created, and all the banks are having their own open banking framework, right? How that framework is helping because there are organizations, especially in the traditional bank, applications which are legacy applications, right? Now there must be some siloed data. There may not be some proper data lake architecture. So how this open banking helping us, right? Or probably they will help us. This open banking will help us in structuring our own data lake.
I think if you talk about data, right? Really, if you look at it, there is an internal problem that all banks have to solve, right? We have to be able to aggregate data from structured and unstructured sources, and to be able to have some cohesive narrative around data.
Yes.
And I think that's the first problem that all of us are dealing with at some stage, or how do we bring all of this together? To me, if you look at it, there are two cornerstones of how data needs to be managed. I think one is data security and data privacy. I think the challenges that open banking will force on us is to say which of the data that we actually have in-house is openable to that kind of an environment, okay? And secondly, it is going to be it's not about competitiveness, please remember. We are looking at, fintechs and other players that are there in the ecosystem to be able to leverage data. It's about which of the data can you expose with the customer's consent that is there, and with the regulators allowing us to be able to do that.
Yes.
I think data security from that standpoint and data privacy from that standpoint is extremely important. And the other thing is encryption. We actually pay a lot of attention to the kind of encryption methodologies, the way we look at data at rest, the way we look at data in transit. Okay, all of that are things that need to be intrinsic to the development of any OpenAI framework. Okay, and the issue that we have that I think we need to address is, do we have confidence in the players that are going to be consuming this data to have the same sensitivity about that security? Okay, and I think governments and regulators are looking at it the same way, right? They are basically saying, okay, this person has a license to do X. Okay, is that person capable of handling the same kind of data privacy and data security that we expect as a country, as an economy? Are we actually will we be able to impose that restriction on those people? I think that's fundamental to it all. How do we deal with data? How do we deal with data privacy? How do we deal with data security? I think these are intrinsic to development of any of these ecosystems, and I think we're getting there. A lot of players, there are a lot of third parties that fundamentally allow us to be able to enable that ecosystem, and it's constantly evolving. I mean, you know that better than me.
It will not be built overnight, right? You'll have to learn. We'll have to learn from it. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And more like a trial and error kind of, to some extent. And talking about this, assessment of the fintechs or assessment of the partners, right? There are checklists, there are metrics, but still it's not foolproof all the time, right? For example, this even talking about API. I know banks are doing the risk categorization of API. There are certain APIs which can be marked as a high risk API, then the medium, then low. All this comes from the framework, right?
Correct. Yep.
All this. So going to the next question, since Deutsche is across the geography, right? And India is one of the major players in open banking, and the way we have evolved our UPI and eco-negative ecosystem, right? What are your views on different geography? I mean, what are the learning or takeaways we can have from different geography? Maybe from Europe, that GDPR thing, then in Australian banks out there coming up.
I think if you look at it, there are obviously a lot of regulations that vary from country to country, right? I mean, there are data residency requirements. There are, geographies are evolving based on what the regulators are telling us we can do. So obviously, if you look at the US, if you look at Germany, if you look at India, they all have varied levels of data privacy. And I think there is a particular bill that's being tabled today, is my understanding. And let's see what comes out of that from an India perspective. But honestly speaking, there are certain basic minimum parameters that companies can also use to be globally available, to be honest with you. I mean, I think I heard 2 of the Zoho presentations that said these capabilities are available globally, right? I mean, the same thing is the case. If you're talking about a fintech, because it's technology enabled, because it's open API enabled, I think it's possible for them to offer those services globally. It doesn't have to be geography dependent. What restrictions that they can actually have will depend upon what the regulators allow you to do. For me, from an evolution standpoint, stringent data regulations that exist are in the EU region, okay? And I think for a reason. The US has regulations which are also fairly, strict. India is also basically coming up with data residency requirements, so on and so forth. I think each of them has its own flavor. I don't want to categorize them saying it's easy to do business in one geography versus the other. I think they all vary and they have their flavors to it.
Yes. I could notice how Anuj reacting when he heard that data privacy bill. Okay, see, we already overshot the time, but my last question, and it's one of my favorite questions, that's what I'm asking. What are the 2 commandments that you'll have to say or that you have to write if you are framing that open banking in future?
Sure, I think the number one that I basically personally would take home is the fact that I would say honor and respect your customers, your vendors, and your partners, which means I think you need to be looking at what is it that you offer to all of these players as an open API provider, okay, and essentially be able to evolve the ecosystem to the next level. The second one that I have is, I think, even more important. This is more internal to how banks operate. Think API when you're actually developing any application. These are probably the 2 things I'll look at.
So you're on the right track. Thanks, Srikanth.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everyone. If you have any questions, we are outside in the lobby. We can interact. But right now, we overshot the time, so we'll not have any Q&A. Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.